current pandemic challenges us, uh, as does life and the spiritual path in general, to strike up a an interesting balance, a kind of paradoxical balance, you might say, um, between accepting that aspect of spirituality that challenges us to make our peace with reality, to accept life as it is, accept ourselves, accept the conditions of our lives externally, accept the world in which we live. This basic dimension of life that's sometimes described as, through other qualities like equanimity, being just sort of, in a sense, a kind of neutrality of neither being attached to things or attracted to particular conditions, or to judging, to repelling, being adverse to particular conditions, an ability to just be balanced, to be open, to be, in a sense, personally neutral. In other words, the key concept behind this is to find a deep inner peace personally that arises from our ability to accept things as they are, to be equanimous, so that we relax that tendency to have conditions on our happiness, to believe, to energize the feeling that only by these conditions can I be happy, and in these conditions I'll be unhappy, and to kind of, in a sense, put ourselves in a tensionful relationship to life because of our attractions and repulsions. Equanimity and acceptance, detachment, dispassion, these kinds of words speak to this quality of just letting things be, just being at peace. It's not a turning away from the world. And in fact, even though it can sound like it at times, a true acceptance and equanimity, not one hiding a kind of inner agenda of disdain or escapism, or a true acceptance is actually simultaneously a profound opening to being deeply present to life. It's not, in fact, at all escapist. It's really about releasing our personal agenda for life to be any different than it might be at any particular moment, or to latch on to particular conditions that might happen to be part of our lives, and therefore become upset when they inevitably pass. So we're neither wishing things were different or attached to them when they're positive, or being upset when conditions aren't to our best liking. If we release all these conditions, we gradually, through acceptance and equanimity, find a deep personal freedom and wholeness within ourselves, an inner peace and nirvana, if you will, freedom from suffering. And that's part of the key, part of the power of equanimity and acceptance, is that it's this profound doorway to that inner freedom. So all the conditions of our lives, internally, what thoughts, what issues we have in our minds, patterns of judgmentalness or memories that we have, emotional reactions, our physical conditions, and so on. All of this is a somewhat internal and personal, immediate situation that we have to come to accept and be present to, and allow it to be that way. And also the outer conditions of our lives, all the facets of the world situation, our personal situation in many different ways. All of that is an ongoing challenge for us, because not because any of those conditions are inherently problematic. Most of our suffering with regard to all of that comes from our desires and aversions, our preferences, conditions, whether, for instance, we're wealthy or poor. in and of itself is not an inherently difficult or positive state one way or the other. It's our attitudes, it's our desires and aversions in relationship to it that make it so. So any change that happens in our lives, maybe we're doing better financially at one point and then we go through a more difficult period, constant opportunities in our practice to keep cultivating greater acceptance, equanimity, coming to a greater place of being at peace with whatever is. So there's a great power and central significance to this dimension of our spiritual practice, but it doesn't entirely describe the path, because there's in some ways we could say it's a more receptive or passive quality, not in the sense that it doesn't have its own kind of radiance and sort of almost like a kind of serene power to deep contentment and inner peace and equanimity, but rather that it doesn't really describe that aspect of enlightenment that's more active, more engaged, where we actually do make decisions, we do express preferences, we do try to, say, improve conditions. Let's say if we're talking to a friend and they're in a state of suffering, at one level of our response, we can cultivate an ability to just be deeply accepting, deeply present, understanding and compassionate, empathetic. And these kind of lean towards, especially those aspects that are just deeply accepting of the person as they are and able to be comfortable with them in that state. But at the same time, we might feel an impulse to say something encouraging. And that aspect of our nature, in a sense, is trying to change something. In a sense, it's trying to improve. And that's really part of our relative nature, too, as human beings incarnate in this world. We do have an active aspect. What changes on the spiritual path is gradually we shift from seeking personal fulfillment through our actions, our desires and aversions. We try to arrange life optimally to be happy. We shift. We use the wisdom of equanimity and acceptance, for instance, to gradually release ourselves from that personal agenda. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't feel a compassionate desire to help others, for instance, to make a positive contribution to the world, to support other people in that process of healing and awakening and deepening into their own inner fulfillment as well, even if that means offering someone some food or other kinds of assistance. It's all part of a general support of being human and our collective participation in spiritual evolution as a kingdom and with all forms of life in our world. So at times, it's a sort of a normal conundrum, a kind of paradox on the spiritual path. How do we reconcile these two? The dimension of the path that seems to have more to do with just being with what is, acceptance, versus that kind of active, engaged aspect. And what we find as our intuition grows is that kind of on a more mental and human level, those two seem like they maybe are somewhat contradictory. But intuition is a sort of another faculty that is more holistic and can see how apparent polarities and opposites can actually just be part of a deep interrelatedness, a way in which yin and yang kind of co-define each other and are mutually a part of a balanced experience of life. For instance, similarly, acceptance and action or engagement also are actually not only compatible, they're really part of a more whole understanding of what enlightenment means. It's not just being or just being passive or just accepting things. It can seem like at times that that's an important aspect to emphasize. And it's a very deep and profound avenue for our spiritual awakening. But just as important as that active side of our nature. And I'm focused on this right now, and especially in the context of this pandemic, because we do want to embrace both aspects of our nature. Some of the exercises that I initially posted recently that are based more on service and visualization kind of emphasize that active aspect. Today I posted another meditation that's more about being with our situation, accepting that aspect of things. And in this talk, I also just wanted to address that these are actually both part of a more whole approach to our spiritual path, and they're not incompatible. In fact, what we find is our ability to be of service, for instance, and to actively engage and to is actually deeply empowered by the depth of our ability to accept ourselves, accept the world situation. Because, well, as I said earlier, for instance, part of that is it frees us up from our own personal concerns. We're able to, through a deep ability to accept ourselves in reality, frees us from personal desires and interests, which can kind of, to some extent, interfere with the depth of our ability to really feel a more profound sense of compassion, of concern, of love for other people. But even that love that's more transpersonal, that's more free of our personal desires, is further refined and illuminated and made spacious and more powerful by the depth of equanimity that we can bring, so that even in our concern for others, we also can bring a depth of okayness with what they're going through too. Each individual needs to go down their own path, their own journey. And we don't know the fullness of what it is that their curriculum entails. What challenges do they need to face? What karma needs to be transformed? What lessons are they learning? So we can do our best to try to support them. But it's important and actually very clarifying to bring a deep amount of acceptance and equanimity in general towards life, and especially saying relating to a specific person, or in this case with the pandemic that we face in the world, to the general conditions of that specific situation that's arising now. The depth of our ability to bring acceptance and equanimity actually will help clarify, to empower, give us some greater wisdom and inner peace even in our active work. So we're not thinking of these also as two kind of separate types of practice, where over here we practice equanimity and acceptance and inner peace, and then over here we practice more engaged activity. Ultimately, we want these to bleed into each other, and there's an active radiance and potency that's even in a simple state of presence, and that also bring that deep inner peace and equanimity of presence into our active work, empowers it, purifies it, elevates it, illuminates it. So these are two deeply interrelated aspects. And sometimes we're going to lean one way or the other in cultivating these and getting to know and deepen our skills, deepen our understanding of these dimensions of our nature and the path. But ultimately, they're part of a single wholeness. The presence ultimately is both active and receptive, both accepting and compassionate and engaged. So our current situation is, in fact, an opportunity, particularly challenging opportunity, to kind of deepen our understanding of that reality and open up new dimensions of our spiritual path and our service.